In order to frame his theory of evolution through natural selection, Charles Darwin needed to provide evidence that evolutionary change could happen in a way that he was describing, in the form of descent with modification. And what we know is that the evidence available at the time he was writing his book is really limited. And much of the evidence that is used uh, at present time in order to describe evolutionary relationships between groups is the type of evidence that was not available when Darwin was writing. And this is going to be evidence in the form of uh, molecular similarities, as I said, similarities in terms of proteins between organisms, DNA, genes, and mutations, and the effect mutations have in the changes of the characteristics of a species over time. So in this presentation about evidence about evolutionary change, some of it was available to Darwin and some of it was not. Let's begin by looking at how evolution, for example, could happen and could be measured. We know that there are some kinds of bacteria that are going to be responsible for serious diseases in humans. Luckily for us, most bacteria on Earth are going to be beneficial to life on Earth. But there's a handful of bacteria strains that could be harmful to us. And one of those is going to be the methicillin resistant strains of Staphylococcus aureus. Staphylococcus aureus is a bacterium that is present in about 40% of the human population. It lives on our skin, it lives at the border of our noses and mouth, but it doesn't cause any problems to most people because Staphylococcus aureus is just part of the uh, bacteria colonies that live on the surface of a person's skin. However, when some diseases, infections are linked to Staphylococcus aureus, it, back in the 1940s, around the time of World War II, when penicillin was discovered, they could, Staphylococcus aureus could easily be killed, destroyed with those antibiotics. But it only took a couple of years for Staphylococcus aureus to become resistant to uh, penicillin. And then other antibiotics were developed to deal with that resistance. And one of those was methicillin. And methicillin became available around 1959, about 15 years after uh, penicillin was discovered. And from 1959 to 1961, it took only about 2 years for Staphylococcus aureus strains resistant to methicillin to develop. And these methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, as they are known as hospitals, are responsible for many of the complications after surgery, infections that result after a procedure has been performed on a patient. And so these changes, how superbugs like MRSA are constantly changing, it has to do with the genetic makeup of these bacteria. And that is one of the evidences one can present to say, look, life changes over time. Evolution does happen, and it can be measured easily at a micro scale with changes in a few genes that may be present now on a species, and those genes were not present years before. And so, what are other forms of evidence that can be presented to imply, to make inferences that life on Earth is the subject of evolution? I'm going to skip a few slides on my presentation. And one type of evidence that was available at the time of Darwin, in fact, uh, Darwin was collecting a lot of these types of evidence is in the form of fossils. The fossil record is one that can be used for looking at how organisms looked in the past, and when these organisms that are now only present in the form of fossils were alive. And what we find in the fossil record is that there are some organisms we see today, and when you look at certain fossil specimens, they show similarities And so one can make a difference where what we see today is something that has evolved over time from this other form seen in the fossil record. Take a look at these fossils we see here. They are called ammonites. Ammonites are not alive on Earth anymore. And these ammonites are going to be showing similarities to other types of mollusks we have now, like the chambered nautilus. And these mollusks, they're also in the same taxonomic group as squid, are now present anymore, but there are evidences we can see here of that spiral pattern on the shell and chambers that were also suspected to have been present on these organisms, like we see now in the chambered nautilus. So as you look at some organisms in the fossil record, you see that many have now completely uh, gone extinct and they're not present anymore on Earth. But we also see that there are patterns in the fossil record when you go to older layers of rocks. And what you can find in those older layers of rocks are going to be only simple forms of life. And as you go to places where sedimentary rock exists, like the Grand Canyon, down below where older layers of rocks are hypothesized to have been deposited by floods, then and only simple forms of life exist. When you go up closer to the surface, you see more and more complex forms of organisms. And so many scientists who work on the field of evolutionary biology suggest that these newer rocks contain more complex organisms because that complexity is something that has evolved over time. One of the things that Charles Darwin was trying to find was more transitional forms of fossils so he could reconstruct from a simpler fossil to a more complex organism similar to the one previously found to another more complex, kind of like a gradual change in support of his theory. However, these gradual changes in the fossil record are going to be, for the most part, non-existent, not in a complete form. And so Charles Darwin commented in his book on the origin of the species about this, the lack of transitional forms, and that continues to be a challenge today, finding a way of demonstrating evolution over time using these transitional forms in the fossil record. Biogeography is another form of evidence Charles Darwin made reference to. And what you see with regards to biogeography, which deals with the distribution of organisms on Earth, is that when you look at islands, the island species are going to be much more similar in their physical appearance to the species that are alive in the nearest continent. So, picking as an example, what you're writing about in your discussion this week about the Galapagos finches, that group of birds in Galapagos shows a lot of resemblance to the finches you can find in South America. But they're going to be more different from the finches found in North America or Europe or Africa or Australia. And so what Charles Darwin did is he inferred that because of the similarities, these Galapagos finches had to have evolved from those finches in South America. He hypothesized some of those birds must have migrated to the islands. And there, over time, they began to change slowly over time, as it is proposed in the model of evolution by natural selection. Now let's take a look at comparative anatomy. When you look at organisms that are hypothesized to have a common evolutionary path, there's going to be some similarities in the body parts. Take a look, for example, at this illustration of the four limbs of four different kinds of mammals: humans, cats, whales, and bats. All of these four limbs are going to show a humerus, a radius, an ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. You can find that in the cat: humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. You can find that in a whale flipper. Here we have the humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges, and the bat has them as well. And so what scientists do is make this inference, make this conclusion, draw this conclusion that all of these four different types of mammals have the same type of limb design because they have all descended from a common ancestor, which, as you read more about evolutionary hypotheses about mammals, it's predicted to have been some form of a reptilian ancestor that had also those types of bones in the forelimbs. So explaining similar structures is something that you can do by means of homologous structures, because these homologous structures, like derived traits, are going to be those that are present in the most recent common ancestor. And these are the ones that you can find evidence often of descent with modification, of an ancestor having a form that eventually is shaped different over time, and depending on the place where organisms can be found. One has to be careful not to confuse homologous traits with analogous structures. Analogous structures are going to be those that show similarity between two groups of organisms, but they are not the result of shared evolutionary history. And so, for example, when you look at, there are certain kinds of organisms like the pectoral fin of a shark and the flipper of a whale. On the outside, those structures look similar. However, structurally inside, they're going to be very different. The pectoral fins of a shark are going to be mostly cartilaginous structures, but the bones in the flipper of a whale are made of a different type of connective tissue, which is what we call bone. Another example you can think about is going to be the wing of a bat. The wing of a bat is nothing but an enlarged hand with a webbing between the fingers. If you compare that to the wing of a bird, that is going to be something very different. The bones are going to be completely different. So just because they have similar function, the wing of a bat and the wing of a bird, doesn't mean that they have been the result of a similar evolutionary process. When you have explanations like different forces leading to a similar kind of a structure with a similar function, that is something we call convergent evolution, and that is not the result of a descent with modification directly, at least. Anyway, so that is another detail that we should be careful about, not to confuse homologous structure with analogous structures. Molecular biology, as I mentioned before, similarities in DNA and proteins are going to be useful also for drawing conclusions, making inferences about similar species that have a similar evolutionary history. When you look at the DNA of all living things, many evolutionary biologists argue that all DNA is always made up of the same four bases: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Therefore, the inference is that all living things have evolved from a common ancestor that had the same type of DNA. Also, when you look at closely related species, there's going to be similarities in proteins. If you take a look at hemoglobin, which is a protein that works as a pigment that carries oxygen or carbon dioxide, comparing human hemoglobin to that of a rhesus monkey, you will find only 8 amino acids different. Compare human hemoglobin to that of a mouse, and you will see that there's about 25 amino acids different. And why you see more amino acid differences is going to be because at least, the hypothesis goes is that there would have been more evolutionary time and more of a divergence with regards to this protein from the ancestor between mice and humans and the hemoglobin you see now in humans. And so the more different a species becomes from the point of view of physical appearance and the physiology, more of those molecular differences are going to be predicted to be found, because it would have been a greater amount of time leading to the appearance of this more recent species. And so that's what we have in terms of molecular biology. And these are some of the main evidences that are provided in biology to frame the hypothesis Darwin proposed first, that all of life on Earth would have evolved from a common ancestor. And We will continue exploring more of these ideas as the quarter goes by.